All right, so this is the fun part where we get to put some of this into action. Let me begin by identifying 4 things that might by some be considered to be controversial topics, okay? I ran these by Trevor. If you like them, I came up with them. If you don't like them, Trevor decided which they'd be, okay? So here's a controversial issue. What do we do in Canada with First Nations and the residential schools issue? I became aware of this from a guy who was in a class of mine that I was teaching at Talbot this summer, he's a pastor in Kamloops. And they had just found, shortly after he got there, 200 bodies in unmarked graves that had been there from a residential school in Kamloops. And you guys probably know these stories better than I do. But here's a question, or put it this way, a statement to respond to. I believe Canada, or the Canadian church, if you want to talk that way, should respond to the legacy of residential schools by ... Here's what I think we should do relative to residential schools. And you can feel free if there's some other kind of First Nations issue that you would like to talk about rather than residential schools. I'm totally fine with that. But the topic focus here is how do we deal with issues relative to the legacy of Canada and the First Nations, and the residential school things have just come up recently in pretty powerful ways. So we were thinking about that. I've also noticed in the brief chat that I had with the 2 Canadians who are in my class that it is a controversial issue apparently about within their own congregations about how it should be responded to. Do we make restitution? If so, what does that look like? Is restitution hopeless at this point? What do we do? Notice it's a very tangible action that's required. It's easy to say, I don't think we should be racist. Great. But ... What is the action point? You can see us pushing towards that far right-hand side of the conviction spectrum here, right? Where you're having to answer, okay, it's a particular policy that we're going to have to think about. Second one, women's roles in churches. I believe the church should be guided by the following conviction when it comes to women in church leadership. I've heard rumors that this is a controversial topic. It's recently become in the course of my evangelical life, it's gone through some interesting life cycle moments too, that it seems to have recently been on the rise as a controversial topic. And then again, notice there's an invitation to take it in different ways, but the request is always that you talk in specifics about that, which might be saying, I think it's fine for women to serve in paid pastoral roles, but they shouldn't serve on the elder board. Or it might be that no women should be called pastors. Or it might be, you know the things that have spun out. And all we want you to do is to think a little bit about some of those kinds of issues. And I'll give you a little more guidance on what that might look like in a sec. Whoopsie. Third one, LGBTQ in the gospel. Engaging the LGBTQ community from a gospel-centered perspective means that the church should fill in the blank. They should welcome everyone. We should have transgender bathrooms. We should or shouldn't use pronouns. We should or shouldn't have the transgender bathrooms. There's so many factors out there. And again, I just want you to think, let me try and tease out my biblical conviction on one facet of this very controversial question. And then fourth, the environment, creation care. I believe the church's responsibility relative to the environment is ... I bumped into a guy, he was a graduate of PhD from a theology program who basically came back with chatting with some, he had been an undergrad at Biola years earlier, but he said, I think climate change is more important than the Great Commission because of the implications for that. You know, the catastrophic apocalyptic implications on the edge of it. That to me is one of those, wow, okay moments. But my sense is probably even more so in Canada than in the United States that the green concerns have become pretty significant politically and pretty divisive within the church. And so pick up on those things however it might strike you. So that's the big idea of those 4 topics. You may be wondering, how will I know which topic to talk about? I am so glad you asked. You have a lanyard on that has a different color than perhaps the person sitting beside you. So when you go into the gymnasium there, you will have a lanyard that will guide you to a table. If it's yellow, you go to the table that has the little thing that says it's for yellow people. There's kind of a sheet of paper in the center of every table. So it's not tricky that way unless you happen to have a blue lanyard. I think you two blue folks there are the perfect example because one of you has a thin blue ribbon, the other has a thick blue ribbon. So we have thin and thick blue because that got us enough different colors from our variables, okay? So otherwise, everybody's good, but you might stop and think if you have just like a thin ribbon that just doesn't have any depth to it, then you're the thin blue. If you have the thicker one that's kind of double-sided, you have the other one. You know what? I think the action point for those who don't have one is find the table that has the least people. So help stock up tables that might be short on people. So yeah, that's the basic plan. So that will be the kind of basic concept that you have for doing that. And here's the topic. Here's the way we're going to do these conversations. One person is going to choose, and he or she will have about 1 to 2 minutes to say what they think about the topic. When I say 1 to 2 minutes, here's the way I want the guideline executed. Someone on your table will have had their name circled on that placemat. You're the lucky winner of the keeper of the stopwatch, so to speak. Also the one who trying to make sure people honor what follows my next 3 points. So you're kind of the referee, but you don't need a striped shirt, and let's don't overplay the job here. But you're just kind of keeping everybody on target. But it is helpful if like a person's been talking for 90 seconds or so, that you just sort of raise the hand. Make some gesture that is like non-combative that just says, hey, warning, your 90 seconds, you're getting to the end of it so people can kind of wrap on their own. Try to avoid just jerking the carpet out from under them, but on the other hand, sometimes people need the reminder. So the person who's circled is kind of the person who's making sure people don't over-talk because we want people to go around the loop. The other thing that we'd like to do is have you follow a particular pattern. I'm going to go through the pattern and explain why it's so important. The pattern is after the first person has started, then you're picking up by doing this, saying, here's what I think I heard John, the first person who spoke, here's what I think I heard John saying, and you play back a little bit of what you understood him to say about this controversial issue. Secondly, you say, here's something I agree with about what he said, or something that touched me, something I kind of resonated with. So pick up a point of common ground, a point of contact that you said, I get it when he said that. And then third, here's one thing I'd like to add to the conversation. And then you can chime in on whatever it is that you would like to say. It might be playing back something in response to the person who just spoke. You can also feel free to just add a point that was just somewhat different. The nice thing about this is you're not like you get one shot and you're done. We'll give you a season for a conversation on this as we kind of go around the loop. The reason for the structure is partly because of the structure of your brain. You have two different ways you respond. People talk about the lizard brain that just instantly reacts to things. And then you have kind of the reasoned brain, which kicks in more slowly. As near as I can tell, this is like just accurate description of human physiology. So if you slow down a conversation a little bit, you move out of your lizard brain and into your reflective mode. And what tends to happen when you get upset, they have done these studies, fascinating studies, particularly related to politics, is how easily we go lizard brain. How much it just evokes this immediate response that shuts down the reflective part. So this is a shameless attempt to keep that from happening because the other part isn't slow. It just isn't nearly as fast as what it takes for a lizard to catch a fly. That's why they call it the lizard brain, is how just incredibly instantly you react. So when you have to pause and say, okay, before I share what I'm thinking here, let me just sit down and say, the person who spoke before me, not necessarily the first person, John, but just whoever just spoke, here's what I heard them saying. Here's what I resonated with. Now let me add something. And you can almost feel the speed bump. It's the equivalent of a speed bump on a road in a parking lot. You just don't want people to drive too fast. And that's the only regulation that I do on these things. And almost always it works out just fine. But it is important that we keep doing that. So the other thing, my request for the person who's paying a little bit of attention to that clock, is also just make sure people follow that pattern. You won't like it after 2 or 3 times. That's okay. I'm not giving it to you because you'll like it. I'm giving it to you because it helps keep a conversation from spinning out of control. Because that usually happens when we talk lizard to each other. Does that make sense? So structure is really simple that way, but it just needs a tiny bit of enforcement or reminders if people drift away from it. Any questions about that structure? Yes. No. You will have one topic, and when you get to your table, you'll know what your lucky winner topic was. Well, when Trevor extended it to 12:30, I was thinking that might work, but that's stretching it. So, you will have one particular thing, and it will be assigned. Honestly, if you guys all at your table want to change it, feel free, but here's the problem. Somebody won't. It'll take too long. Just give it a whirl with the topic that you have, because the main point here is the learning experience, playing around and seeing a bit of what it feels like. That's all we're doing, and then we'll debrief the process. When you get into the other room, where was my, okay, well, let me just use this. So in the big folder that you have, were you Bob? Was that your name? Yeah. So I better be careful. That thing's going to give us feedback. But there's a sheet of paper all the way at the end that just says conviction map. It has 4 columns. Here you go. When you get to your table in there, you'll know what particular topic that you happen to have. And before you talk, I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to just try and do a little bit of work on one of those conviction maps. And you remember I talked about showing your work. Don't freak out. For all of you who have math anxiety, and I said it's like a math problem where you have to show your work. Don't freak out. I'm not going to grade it. But I want you to go through that process of thinking, here's what I feel about this issue, but where does that really come from? Are there life experiences I have that have shaped me, that you would identify some of those? What are the commands or teaching of Scripture I think contribute to this issue? To try and do just a little bit of that thinking. And sometimes the great learning experience from that is that, I have a super strong conviction. But when it came time for me to show all the work that it came from, it was way harder than I thought. Oh my gosh. Sometimes what you bump into is the fact like this happened to me when I started thinking about immigration. This was the thing that I wasn't particularly cognizant of until some things when Donald Trump was talking about building the wall. And I realized I had a very strong visceral reaction against building a wall. And I thought, what's the deal? And I began to think a little bit about that experience with my dad. So you may have one of those aha moments. I don't know what you'll find as you do that, but usually you find something. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that before we share. And I'll be in there. We'll get you all going at the right times and stuff. But does that all make sense? So you'll identify your table, you'll figure out what your topic is, and we'll give you a few minutes to do your conviction map just to get your wheels turning. And then we'll have you have probably about 20, 25 minutes of conversation around the tables. And Trevor and I will be walking around and trying to help troubleshoot if there's any problems. You have a pseudo leader there who's kind of keeping track of things too, and hopefully all together this whole thing will work just fine. If not, I plan on hopping on a plane in a few minutes. You'll never find me again, so it's really no big deal. All right, let's head to the gym or the cafe, wherever it is we've been hanging out in there.